everybody, welcome to History Club at Lee County Libraries. I'm Miss Sarah, and today I have the honor of sitting down with Mr. John Lipscomb, and he is going to tell us a little bit about some of our notable Native Americans from this month.
Hello, I'm certainly happy to be here and glad that you asked me. I'm a history major and taught history for 32 years and just glad to be here. And like to inform you on anything that I might know about the Native Americans and the women of the Native Americans.
So I see that you're part of the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Right, I've been a member for about 20 years. My mentor and friend, Dr. Klein here in Sanford, got me to join, and we've been out to 8 or 9 national conventions in Montana and Oregon and Charlottesville, Virginia, and Richmond and DC and all those places. The Lewis and Clark Trail was kind of the opening of the West for the people, and I became very interested in that, and then we've covered most of the trail going from all the way from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania out to Astoria, Oregon. It's been a wonderful time.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. What got you interested in studying this topic?
Well, I was a history major, and of course I'd already done the Oregon Trail, and Dr. Klein really inspired me to go with him to Montana for the National Convention. And it was really something because it was a bicentennial. And when they were gone for 2.5 years, and people didn't think they were alive anymore. And when they came back to St. Charles, Missouri, they had a big ovation there, and of course everybody was there for the reenactment, and there were several thousand people. CNN News, Fox News were there. It was pretty big stuff. They brought some of the Native Americans back with them and a lot of artifacts, and they were the first civilized Americans that had been actually west of North Dakota. So it was the first trip.
Yeah, that's really cool. So this month, Mr. Jordan told us a little bit about some notable Native Americans, and one of whom was Sacagawea. So we thought that maybe you'd have a little bit more information that you'd like to share about her.
Well, Sacagawea is certainly a good story. She was around 17 years old. She was pregnant whenever Captain Lewis and Clark met her, and so they had to wait for her to have the baby. And then that spring, with the baby on her back, just several months old, they took off from there all the way out to Oregon, mostly on canoes and on foot and other things. Sacagawea is the one that kind of led the way because she was from the Idaho area, and helped them a lot with the native roots and stuff and interpretations, and they couldn't have made the trip without Sacagawea, and her being such a young person. Also, something I thought was very interesting was when they got to Oregon, they were on camp for the winter, and so we're trying to decide whether they'd camp on the north side of the Columbia River or the south side of the Columbia River. Now, Lewis and Clark, that was a military expedition, so they could have made the decision, but they decided to let the members of the Corps of Discovery vote on it, and it was the first recorded history of an African American who was with them, York, and an Indian woman, which was Sacagawea, that they actually got a vote 100 years before women got the right to vote and 60 years before African Americans got the right to vote. And I thought that was interesting. They actually voted. Everybody got one vote on which side of the river they would spend the winter on.
Yeah.
I thought that was pretty interesting.
That is really interesting. Something else that Jordan mentioned was that after the expedition was over, that Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea all remained like in communication with each other. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that is true. Now, they dropped Sacagawea off back in South Dakota when they came down. Clark really liked the little boy Pomp. That was what he called his son. And so he actually, I guess, quote, adopted him and asked him to come down, and he educated him. And the little boy grew up over in Europe, learning some of the cultural ways of the Europeans, and later led expeditions back into Washington, Idaho, in Montana, and he died out west. He was kind of a hero at the time because he was 67 years old, and everybody remembers him when he was a little baby, carried on his mama's back all that way.
That's cool. Is there anything else that you would tell us about her that
Well,
you'd
yeah,
like to share?
Sacagawea was really, there are more statues to her than any other American woman. And also they put her on the coin that I brought you. The dollar had Sacagawea there on the, carrying her little baby on the back. It's just a good story of a teenage Indian woman who was vital to opening the West.
Is there anyone else that you would want to tell us about? Any other stories you'd like to share?
Well, she's the one I'm the most familiar with, but there's a lot of women that helped out. They just never got credit where credit was due. I learned through Ancestry.com, but I am kin to Pocahontas, as some of my kin folks pointed out. The Native Americans, especially women, were just very underrated. They did an awful lot for the American people, but weren't given a lot of credit for it.
Well, thank you so much for telling us a bit about them and
I
shining
enjoyed
some
being
more
here.
light on them.
Well, thank you very much for having me. The one on the left is called the Peace Medallion that Thomas Jefferson gave to the men to give out to the tribes, the American chiefs and so forth. So it was like a peace symbol. On the front of the coin is President Jefferson. On the back of the coin is a peace treaty with the peace pipes in them shaking hands. And so it's kind of to show the white American men that were in charge and the Native Americans at a peace treaty. And then, of course, the Sacagawea with her with a baby on the back.
Hello and welcome to History Club for this month. Today, in honor of Native American Heritage Month, our topic is Notable Native Americans. The pictures here represent different Native American tribes. Can you guess which ones? This represents the Sioux. This represents the Napiers. This represents the Tlingit. This represents the Iroquois. This one is the Cherokee, and this one is the Pueblo. So the first notable Native American we're going to talk about is Hiawatha. We don't know exactly what tribe Hiawatha was from. We know that he was Iroquois, but there were 5 tribes of Iroquois: the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, the Mohawk, and the Seneca. We think he was part of the Onondaga tribe, but he may have lived and been adopted by the Mohawk tribe. So the way we know about Hiawatha is through Iroquois legend. There weren't written accounts of him. There were stories that were passed down through the generations of Iroquois. The Iroquois lived in what is today upstate New York, and we don't know exactly when Hiawatha lived. We know it was before Europeans colonized upstate New York. So it's estimated it may have been around the 1500s, or it may have been even earlier, like the 1300s or 1400s. We don't know exactly. But according to Iroquois legend, Hiawatha's family was killed, and that plunged him into a deep, dark depression. He was eventually cured by a prophet known as the Great Peacemaker, or simply the Peacemaker. Together, they traveled to the 5 tribes of the Iroquois and united them, bringing peace and overthrowing a tyrannical warlord. Once Hiawatha brought peace, he taught the following skills to the Iroquois: agriculture, the arts, medicine, and navigation. Also, the Iroquois were said to have buried their weapons of war underneath a tree of peace at this time. One of the most famous references to Hiawatha in culture is the poem The Song of Hiawatha by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He was the poet who also wrote The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Now, in the poem, Hiawatha brings peace because he's in love with a woman from a rival tribe named Minnehaha. But that's not accurate according to the Iroquois legends. It's likely that Longfellow got Hiawatha mixed up with other Native American legends. But that did inspire a famous statue by Edmona Lewis. And she was a woman of mixed African American and Native American heritage who created this statue right here in honor of Hiawatha. So the next Native American we're going to learn about is Squanto or Squanto. Squanto was born a member of the Pocahontas tribe, but he was later adopted by the Wampanoag. And if you're wondering why that is, it's because Squanto was captured and enslaved, and he was brought from his homeland in what is now Massachusetts across the seas to Britain and Spain. Now there are two accounts of Squanto's capture and enslavement. In one, he was captured by a man named George Weymouth in 1605, and another he was captured by a man named Thomas Hunt in 1614. And it's possible that he was captured, escaped, and was recaptured and re-enslaved later on. However, we do know that he eventually escaped and made it home to Massachusetts, only to find out that the Pocahontas tribe had almost completely been wiped out by disease, and the only remaining members were now a part of the Wampanoag tribe. Later, a group of Puritan separatists, who we now know as the Pilgrims, arrived and founded Plymouth Colony. They experienced a lot of hardship at first because they didn't know how to plant corn or do anything like that. But luckily for them, they met Samoset, who was a member of the Wampanoag tribe. And Samoset understood that they spoke a different language than he did, but he knew someone who did speak their language, and that was Squanto. So Squanto had learned to speak English during the time he had been enslaved, and he served as the translator for the Wampanoag people. The Wampanoag chief, Massasoit, made him a sort of ambassador to the Pilgrims. And Squanto taught the Pilgrims about planting corn, hunting, and fishing. Now, unfortunately for Squanto, he died of disease not too long after that. Only about a year after he met the Pilgrims, he died in 1622. The next Native American we're going to learn about is Pocahontas, or at least that's the name we know her by today. Her real name would have been something like Matoaka. Pocahontas was her nickname. It means playful one. So Pocahontas was a member of the Powhatan tribe, and Powhatan was also the name of her father, who was chief of that tribe. We mainly know about Pocahontas from her experiences with Jamestown, and the most famous story about her comes from John Smith. John Smith's account is that he was taken prisoner by Chief Powhatan, and he was about to be executed by Powhatan warriors when Pocahontas threw herself on top of him to save him. That's illustrated here. However, that story is likely untrue. John Smith didn't start telling that account of the story until many years later after Pocahontas had died. And even if there was some truth in it, it's possible that they were simply performing a ceremony that he didn't understand. Anyway, Pocahontas was very friendly with Jamestown, and she often made visits there. However, on one of those visits, when war was about to break out between her father and the Virginia settlers, she was taken hostage. This hostage situation ended when she converted to Christianity and married John Rolfe. John Rolfe was the Englishman who introduced tobacco to the Virginia colony, thus making it profitable. And marriages were often used at this time as a way to make alliances or friendships. And so her marriage ended this hostility between the Virginia settlers and her father's tribe. She and John Rolfe had a son named Thomas, and Pocahontas visited England not long after that. However, this was not a good idea because diseases that were not deadly to Europeans could be very deadly to Native Americans. And Pocahontas died of disease before returning home to Virginia. Next up is Sacagawea. Sacagawea was a member of the Shoshone tribe. At least that's the tribe she was born into. She was captured at a time of war by the Hiawatha tribe, and she was adopted into that tribe. And when she was old enough, she was married to a trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau. Now, at the time, you had many French-Canadian explorers coming down from Canada and exploring the American West to trap animals like beavers whose pelts could be used for fur coats and hats over in Europe. And Toussaint Charbonneau was one of these people. When Lewis and Clark came by, Lewis and Clark had been hired by Thomas Jefferson to explore the Louisiana Purchase. That's land that extends from Louisiana all the way to Montana that Thomas Jefferson had purchased from France for very cheap. And he commissioned Lewis and Clark to explore this new territory to learn about plants and other animals and other wildlife, and about the many Native American tribes to map out rivers and landscapes. And so they hired Toussaint Charbonneau and Sacagawea as guides for their expedition. Sacagawea proved a very important member of the team, and she was noted for helping to save maps and other supplies when one of the boats capsized. Also, after they reached the mountains and could no longer use boats, she played a very important role there too. They came across the Shoshone people, who Sacagawea, if you remember, had originally been part of, and Sacagawea discovered that her brother was the new chief of the tribe. She made a deal to get horses for the expedition so they could travel over the mountains. Because of the good teamwork from the Lewis and Clark expedition, and that included Sacagawea, the Lewis and Clark expedition only lost one member during their whole trip, and that was someone who died of a disease before they even reached Sacagawea. She became very good friends with William Clark, and William Clark was very fond of her two children. Sacagawea had her first child while on the expedition, and William Clark was very fond of him, and he helped out with her kids' education. Years later, after the Lewis and Clark expedition had ended in 1812, Sacagawea died fairly young, unfortunately, and that was at Fort Manuel in Kennel, South Dakota. Okay, it's trivia time. let's see if you were paying attention. Which notable Native American was a member of only one tribe? Was it A, Hiawatha, B, Squanto, C, Pocahontas, or D, Sacagawea? You can pause the video if you need some extra time. That's good. The answer is C, Pocahontas. She was only a member of the Powhatan tribe. Hiawatha had been Onondaga and a Mohawk. Squanto had been both Pawtuxet and Wampanoag, and Sacagawea had been both Shoshone and Hidatsa. The next notable Native American we're going to learn about is Charles Curtis. So Charles Curtis had a white father, but his mother was of Native American descent, primarily the Kaw. And the Kaw people are also known as the Kansa, and they live in Kansas. Charles Curtis actually spoke French and Kansa first before learning English. Now, Charles Curtis's dad left when he was very young, and also his mom died when he was very young. So he lived with his grandparents on the Kaw Reservation till around 1873. In 1873, the Kaw tribe was ordered to move to Oklahoma. At the time, Oklahoma was deemed Indian Territory by the United States government. Charles Curtis originally wanted to leave with his grandparents to travel to Oklahoma, but they told him no. They told him that he had a bright future ahead of him and that he'd receive more education by staying in Kansas. So Charles Curtis went to live with his other set of grandparents, his grandparents on his father's side of the family. And he went to law school to become a lawyer. Now, before he became a lawyer, as he was working his way through school, he used his love of horses to make money. He was a cab driver, which at the time was a horse-drawn carriage rather than an automobile. He was also a jockey, so he was the guy who was on top of the horse during the horse race. Eventually, he went from being a lawyer to being a congressman and finally to being a senator. And he became the Senate Majority Leader during the 1920s, during the Calvin Coolidge administration. Now, he seemed like a very good candidate to run for president, and even though Calvin Coolidge was a very popular president, he had decided not to run again. But Calvin Coolidge wanted Herbert Hoover to take over the presidency from him, so Charles Curtis wound up becoming vice president instead, and he was the first person of color to serve in that role. So, Charles Curtis's stances included the fact that he was pro-suffrage, so pro-women's right to vote, and anti-child labor. Unfortunately, his time in Congress and the Senate leaves a bit of a mixed legacy, though. So the Dawes Act was an act that had passed that broke up tribal land. Before the Dawes Act passed, certain land in Oklahoma had been designated for certain tribes. The Dawes Act broke up this land and parceled it out to Native American individuals, leaving what was left behind for white settlers. Now, this not only took away land from the Native Americans, but it also was an attack on tribal identity, because now land was being assigned to people to farm individually instead of communally. Thus, it was an attack on tribalism itself. Originally, the Dawes Act had excluded 5 tribes: But the Curtis Act, named for Charles Curtis because he was the one behind it, made it so that these tribes were no longer excluded. So now these 5 tribes also had their land divided up. Some felt the assimilation these acts encouraged was necessary for Native Americans to advance in society through things like education, which Charles Curtis himself had advanced through. But many people today feel this forced assimilation was very harmful to Native American tribes, and thus why Charles Curtis has such a mixed legacy. One positive thing to end on, though, is that while Charles Curtis was a senator, in 1924 the Indian Citizenship Act passed. This granted full citizenship to all Native Americans. That doesn't mean it ended all discrimination immediately, of course, but it was a huge step forward for Native Americans. Now we're going to learn about Jim Thorpe. Jim Thorpe was a descendant of a few different tribes, including the Sac, the Fox, and the Potawatomi. The Native American name that Jim Thorpe has means bright path. So Jim Thorpe was born in Oklahoma, and in school he wasn't a very good student because his interest was in sports. He eventually went to the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, and he made this small college into a college football powerhouse. After his great football career at Carlisle, he went on to the 1912 Olympics, where he became the first person to win the pentathlon, which is the 5-event track meet, as well as the decathlon, which is the 10-event track meet. These games were held in Sweden, and Sweden's king called Jim Thorpe the greatest athlete in the world. Unfortunately, these medals that he won were later taken away from him because, as it turns out, he had played minor league baseball, and the rules at the time stated that no professional athlete could compete in the Olympic Games, only amateur athletes. Many people find this to be an injustice nowadays, considering that it was minor league baseball instead of major league baseball. And eventually the Olympic Committee would name him co-winner of these Olympic events. Now, Jim Thorpe did go on to have a Major League Baseball career later on. It started the next year in 1913 and lasted until 1919. Jim Thorpe was obviously a very good baseball player to make it to the major leagues, but he wasn't one of the all-time greats. He wasn't a Hall of Famer. But in football, he became one of the first pro football stars. He played professional football from 1915 to 1928, and he was a champion in 1916, 1917, and 1919. The National Football League was started in 1920 as the American Professional Football League, and he became the first major star. One of the teams he played for was an all-Native American team called the Oorang Indians. Now, unfortunately, this team perpetuated some stereotypes with their marketing. Still, Jim Thorpe showed he could be a star on the football field. Later on, after his football career, he decided to get into acting. Now, he wasn't as big of a star anymore, so when he went into acting, he mainly got small parts. One small role he played was as a coaching assistant in a movie called Jim Thorpe All-American, which was a movie about his own life. Now, unfortunately for Jim, he had some struggles around this time. He went through 2 divorces and he struggled with alcoholism. And by the time he died, he didn't have a lot of money. But his fame lives on. In fact, the Associated Press named him the greatest athlete of the first half of the 20th century. The next person we're going to learn about is Maria Tallchief. Maria Tallchief was of Osage descent on her father's side, and she was born in Fairfax, Oklahoma in 1925. Her family actually grew up fairly well off because her dad had made good investments, particularly in oil. From a young age, they enrolled Maria and her sister Marjorie in dance lessons, and it was clear to their parents right away that they had an amazing skill for this. Maria and Marjorie spent their teen years in Los Angeles training and performing dancing parts there. But Maria's career really took off when she moved to New York as a young adult at the age of 17. When she moved to New York, she started dancing with the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo, which was a Russian-themed ballet group in New York City. She started out as an understudy, but quickly moved to a lead role. She performed not only in New York City, but in Paris and even in Russia itself. After leaving the Ballet Russe, she danced briefly with the Paris Opera Ballet before becoming one of the original members of the New York City Ballet. Some of her most famous roles include the Firebird in The Firebird by Igor Stravinsky and the Sugar Plum Fairy in The Nutcracker by Peter Tchaikovsky. When she started dancing professionally, people wanted her to change her name to Maria Tallchieva. Now, she did change her last name, but here's how. Originally, her last name was 2 words, and she shortened it to 1 word, Tallchief. But she didn't want to get rid of that last name because she was so proud of her Native American heritage and wanted to display it for the world to see. Later on, after she retired in the mid-1960s, she moved to Chicago. And in Chicago, she taught ballet to a new generation, along with her sister Marjorie. Together, they formed the Chicago City Ballet Group, and she was a notable teacher for many years throughout the 1980s. She was awarded the Kennedy Center Honor and a medal from the National Endowment from the Arts. Next up, we'll learn about Wilma Mankiller. Wilma Mankiller was the first female principal chief of the Cherokee people. She served in this role from 1985 to 1995. She was born in Oklahoma, but her family moved to San Francisco when she was a kid. During the 1960s, when she was a young adult, she got married and had 2 daughters. However, in the 1970s, she and her husband divorced, and she returned to Oklahoma. After returning to Oklahoma, she worked for the Cherokee government, where she became passionate about causes that would help the Cherokee people. In 1979, she survived a major car crash, but she overcame that difficulty to continue working for the Cherokee, and in 1983 she was elected deputy chief before becoming principal chief in 1985. The 2 causes she was most passionate about and fought hardest for were for better education and better health care. Eventually, the injuries that she sustained in the car crash, which plagued her the rest of her life, were so overwhelming that she retired from being principal chief in 1995. But after retiring, she taught at Dartmouth College and wrote several books. It's trivia time again. Let's see if you were paying attention. If you were, this should be an easy one. Which state was once deemed Indian Territory by the United States government? Here's a hint right here, and you can pause the video if you need a minute. The answer is Oklahoma. So one last trivia time. Let's see how well you know these notable Native Americans from the 20th century that we just talked about. Which notable Native American was not born in Oklahoma? Is it A, Charles Curtis, B, Jim Thorpe, C, Maria Tallchief, or D, Wilma Mankiller? You can pause the video if you need a moment to think about it. The answer is A, Charles Curtis. Remember, he was born in Kansas. Here are our citations for the title slide and for the picture of Oklahoma for trivia time. Here are the citations for Hiawatha, Squanto, Pocahontas, and Sacagawea. And here are the citations for Charles Curtis, Jim Thorpe, Maria Tallchief, and Wilma Mankiller. Thank you so much for joining us for History Club this month. Be sure to tune in next month where we'll have another brand new topic for you. Until then, goodbye and take care.